Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global Data Systems webinar on what's your security maturity, why you need it, and how to achieve it. My name is Jamie Guidry, and I'm the marketing manager here at Global Data Systems, and I'll be providing some introductions as well as some housekeeping items before handing it over to Robert Guidry, Bob Miller, and Tracy Webb. Before we get started, we respect your time, and we'll not run over 55 minutes. And as this is an interactive webinar, participating in live polls and questions are strongly encouraged. But last but not least, this webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy within the next few days. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Robert, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hey, good afternoon. Thank you, Jamie. Quick introduction. I'm Robert Guidry. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here over at Global Data Systems. Been here for a little over 23 years. Prior to that, I was working in the Air Force in calibration, repair of test equipment, system automation, and so forth. So today, we're at Global Data Systems. I'm responsible for really the design of our products, the delivery, the standard installation, and really the key thing here is making sure that we have products and services that achieve an outcome for our customers. Thank you.
Hi, this is Bob Miller. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Global Data Systems, and I'd like to welcome everybody this afternoon. I've got about 30 years experience in technology fields. My degrees are in computer science and mathematics, and I have worked, again, about 30 years or so moving up, going into different organizations and applying technology to solve problems, which is what I do here. I'm a patented inventor. Also, I'm responsible for the day-to-day operations for GDS, but I also manage the software development assets that we have, and our Security Operations Center reports directly to me. So I'm here to do business strategies and support our product development efforts, and then we're also all involved in driving innovation inside of Global Data Systems.
Hi, hello, my name's Tracy Webb. I've got roughly a little over 25 years of experience in IT and cybersecurity. I started out in the United States Navy in cryptography and encrypted communications and intelligence. I'm part of the team here that helps guide GDS in their corporate security hardening and maturity, and help in the development of and creation and deployment of our security products. Recently was lucky enough to be appointed a board member of ASACA in Baton Rouge, so that's exciting. And I'm really glad to have you guys here today and hear our message about our security maturity leveling philosophy. Thank you.
All right, so again, we welcome everybody. This particular webinar, when we were thinking about the subject matter, we've spent, GDS in general, we've spent about two years solid looking into all the angles that really are a part of the ecosystem of cybersecurity. And that was because we're a managed service provider, so we really had to be as current as anyone else on cybersecurity tactics and solutions. So we spent a great deal of time working on it for our own organizations, but we've also brought it to our customer base in different forms. And as we were developing and working with our customer base, the thing that was pretty clear was there wasn't a really easy way for us to be able to explain all of these different facets of the cybersecurity ecosystem, which we're going to go over as we do this discussion, how they all work together, what they really accomplished, and what you really need to be thinking about at a strategic level if you're a C-level or decision maker in your company or enterprise about, hey, we really know we got to, our cybersecurity strategy is X. What do you need to be thinking about as it relates to that? And we needed to find a way to be able to have a easy discourse with our customers and how to explain how that was all done. So that basically was the birth of the security maturity level framework. So we developed that because there's already operational maturity levels and other types of maturity levels, which are basically frameworks that allow you to kind of gauge where you are against yourself and your peers, as far as how you have what steps you've taken inside that enterprise to harden your organization, and then what decisions you need to make on a go-forward basis as it relates to budgets and those types of things. So we created this security maturity level framework so that we could actually help explain that. So what the SML framework really is, it's just an indicator of what an enterprise's investment in risk mitigation and loss prevention. That's really what it is. It describes all of the fundamental systems and or processes or policies that need to be in place to be able to advance your organization up in the security maturity level, and as far as scoring where you are against yourself, and in doing so, you're hardening your organization in a proactive, consistent way. And honestly, not everybody can afford to put every facet of security strategy in play simultaneously day one. They have to find a way to kind of bring that in as they're able to afford it and budget for it and that sort of deal. Now, the security maturity level, it does not, at no point does any cybersecurity strategy ever guarantee you that you will never be touched by some cyber criminal. That's really not what any cybersecurity policy or framework is about, or even any products are about. If someone tells you that they can protect your organization, absolutely, they're just either don't know the difference or being a little bit too wide with their definition of what it is that prevention really is, right? Really all of these aspects of the security maturity level help you mitigate risk and reduce the amount of time you are out of service and speed the recovery from that. That's really what all of these elements of the framework are. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's basically a security in-depth architecture that kind of explains a multi-layered approach, to minimize risk. And that really is what the SML is all about. So in this discussion, we're looking at it in terms of, okay, well, what is your SML? Now, we're not asking you to tell us what your SML is. We're just telling you that in order to determine your subject, your security maturity level, there's a bunch of factors that are involved in that, right? So there are factors like what vertical you're in, whether or not you have compliance constraints that are part of that process. If you're medical and you have to deal with HIPAA, or if you're financial and you have those kind of compliance constraints, all those are factors in what you really need to be considering from a security maturity level and a security strategy sort of perspective. So that's, and then in recent years with cyber insurance and the constraints that are on that, and the ever improving constraints on that, what you have to have in hand is an incident response plan, right? So that's another important factor of the security maturity level. So, Tracy, give just a couple one blurber there, about what is an incident response plan and how that kind of fits.
Yeah, so really what every company needs to have documented well in advance is what an incident response plan is in terms of how they're going to react to a breach or a malware event or an exfiltration of data. They need to understand, the systems that may hold that proprietary data, or what we like to call the family jewels. Every company has a different version of this. As Bob mentioned, a medical industry type client might have HIPAA data on various devices or servers, or transmit it in certain ways, versus an oil and gas company or a finance company. So really what you have to have down is a way that you can first identify what's happened, how did it happen. Second, how you can mitigate it in terms of stopping it from continuing. And third, you need to be able to recover from that. And if you don't have that documentation and that process and procedure in place well in advance, essentially what's going to happen is you're going to lose continued productivity. Your company is going to be down for business until you can get it back up. So an IR plan ahead of an event is crucial for every company.
Yeah, the one thing that we've learned in talking with our customers, right, when we put our incident response plan together, and then we just started talking to our customer base about whether or not they had one, the one overwhelming fear for them is they didn't really understand what happens once you have been breached, right? So that they could at least get their mind around putting some sort of plan together about how to react to a breach, but they didn't really have a feel for what happens after the breach. So that was another good point for us to have a discussion with them about their incident response plan and what it really addressed, because it turned out there's a lot of detail that's involved in managing, a breach. We've been involved in doing that with several clients, and we've learned a lot over the last couple of years, because I think we've done about a half dozen of them, in conjunction with our customer base who have been breached in one way or another. And that incident response plan always came to top of mind. So, it's not, I see that, from the poll, we're about split about how many have got one and how many are working on one, which is actually, that's great. That's a much better percentage than I was thinking might be there. So that's really good. It's really good to see that. So see that everybody's at least got it in mind and they're in the process of putting it together. So this whole security maturity level, incident response plan is one element of that, right? It's just a single element of that ecosystem. Everything from vulnerability scans to network assessments. Robert, why don't you talk about a few other elements that are a part of that SML, kind of give them an idea.
No, absolutely, Bob. So we kind of take a look at, backtracking to the incident response plan. It's going to be a set of activities based upon an outcome that you're trying to achieve, and oftentimes those are also encouraged by your cyber insurance carrier. So we can kind of bring that into the picture as well too. So if you take a look at some of the cyber insurance requirements out there, there's a number of things that we can see a customer do to reduce their risk and improve their security levels. One of the top ones right off the bat is multi-factor authentication. That one's way up at the top of the list.
Right.
Some of the other things that we really take a look at is identifying who's on your network, right? Most organizations use Active Directory to control who can get on their network. We want to take a quick look at that one and make sure that there's no ex-employees that are still in that environment. Make sure that they cannot get to the network. Really, probably next from that particular perspective, you want to start doing some inventory. You really need to make sure of what's out there, what's on your network, what type of hardware is out there, what type of operating systems are out there. And once you get a good feel of what's in your network, then you can start analyzing the risk that those devices could pose to your network. And then from there, you start taking a look at mitigation techniques. It could be anything from patching operating systems that are no longer supported by the manufacturer, or replacing those, maybe patching them with security levels. And then as you mature through this process, you'll start taking on some additional actions. Segmentation is critical, right? How do we make sure that we protect our assets and move our protected assets away from a more general appliance type asset? Like case in point, we had there was a breach, very well known breach, a few years ago. It was from a retail perspective. The point of sale system was compromised. Millions and millions of credit cards were leaked and they were stolen. The original attack was not from or not for the point of sale systems. The initial breach was on the HVAC systems, the heating, ventilation, and AC. It was considered a low priority system, did not have a lot of security. And because it was not segmented from their critical assets, the hacker was able to get into that system and then slowly navigate their way to their prized possession, was the point of sale. Which brings up another interesting point. The average time from breach to actual detection is over 200 days. So even people that maybe have not noticed or had sensed that they've been breached, oftentimes they have. It's just it hasn't bubbled up to the top yet.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't realize this is a long game for these folks, so
absolutely.
They don't move quickly, because if they did, they'd be living indicators that if you had systems that were monitoring and managing those aspects of your network, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get to how to achieve it, how to actually achieve your security level, your security maturity level, how to achieve a higher security maturity level, then we'll talk more about those actual implementations. But the why do you need it is the so I kind of told you a little bit about what that security maturity level framework is. It's aspects of, like Robert's talking about, network segmentation, multi-factor authentication, incident response plan, things that most people don't think about, like your secure certificate use on your network, because most people don't know that those digital certificates actually drive a lot of the underlying security on servers. And if those servers are access control servers, then those are really core elements of the network, and not many people talk about the fact that you really need to be monitoring your security digital certificates and their generation and their expiration and how they're configured. Another very subtle thing, but we know from the breach at SolarWinds, which was this was a supply chain breach where the bad actors got into the software development chain of a vendor who provides network monitoring software, which allowed it to get in a lot of places very quickly, or very deeply, let me say. And one of the aspects of that failure involved the fact that they really weren't monitoring their digital certificate ecosystem and how those certificates were generated, who generated them and when, and that basically allowed that breach to occur. So why do you need it? So and why do you need it is because you really are going to have to get cyber insurance. If you don't have it, you're going to have to get it at some point, because the bad guys ecosystem is evolving as fast as the deterrent side of the development is going. And in reality, there are service providers for hackers now. So you can decide one day to be a hacker, go online, sign up for a plan. Now it's not in any place that you'll get prosecuted with by the law. You can't. Nobody's doing this in the U.S., but in other countries they are doing this, and they'll provide you all the tools and the system to do it. And all you got to have is enough spare time to basically execute the tools and cast your net as wide as you want. What that means is there's going to be more and more low-level intrusions attempted on everyone's network that could work into higher and higher exposures, right? Or exfiltration of data, or all those other things. So cyber insurance is going to be definitely a requirement. You're going to have this at some point. And the requirements for cyber insurance are changing, and they're changing very quickly. Tracy, you want to talk a little bit about how those constraints are changing on cybersecurity?
Yeah, for sure. As I think back in 2011, maybe I have it 2001 or 2011. There's a one in there. Was really the first incident or case of a cyber insurance or what was known as an information security policy being sold by an insurance company. So fast forward to, let's say, I don't know, 3 years ago. Most of the time you could approach an insurance company and talk to them about cyber insurance, and it was pretty much a done deal. They would just say, sure, how much? And they'd say, okay, here's your policy, and here's how much you have to pay us. Where we are today, due to some things that California legislation has pushed, due to Louisiana, in fact, is one of the first states in the country to enact a certain form of policy and legislation in terms of the way that you have to communicate your incidents or your breaches to the FBI if you're a user of Louisiana tax dollars. And then just as recently, we saw, because of the cyber attack activity occurring because of or as a part of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, just recently there's almost legislation coming out every day where they're trying to pass a bill that every company will have to notify CISA or Department of Homeland Security about any breach they have, regardless of organization, regardless of size of company. I saw just today a bill that was going to be signed in, at least at the federal level at this point, that it was mandatory that all organizations in the Fed structure were going to have an MFA product. So what we're seeing over and over again is the attack occur, the insured company having to reach out to their insurance company, and then that payout happens. And it's just like any other insurance. If the insurance company, if you're going to put your 18-year-old son on your car insurance, you can bet that's going to be a pretty high premium, right? As he gets older and he proves himself and he's more mature, his insurance will lower. In the same way that cyber insurers are going to do that with industry and with companies in every vertical, and demand that you provide some proof of at least a leveling up of your security maturity with some compliance to NIST and CISA and other federal guidelines. Or if you can get insurance at all, it's going to be so expensive, it's almost going to price yourself out of any risk mitigation through an insurer.
Yeah, and that when Tracy talks about the cost increase, I mean, we're seeing that even this year, because of the number, there were about 72 billion in ransomware, I think, last year, something along those lines. We've seen the cost of that insurance already. Those premiums are starting to rise because they're having to pay out. They didn't really have a baseline to know what they were going to have to pay out when they started selling cyber insurance policies. But as the number of incidents and events have occurred, then they've had to pay out more, right? And so now they're starting to mature themselves about, okay, well, how do we start leveling this so that we're not taking all the liability as an underwriter, and make the enterprise be partially responsible for putting in place what is now more practical ways of achieving a higher security maturity level. So that's what's happening. And I see, we just did this poll, right? How many of you guys had cyber insurance? How many of you didn't? Now, I will tell you that one of the clients that we worked with, I guess it was the year before last, who got ransomware. I mean, they quite literally lost $10 million in down. They were a logistics company, so when they got hit, it basically kept their goods from being delivered from point A to point Z because their systems were down, and they lost about $10 million in a week and lost income because of that factor. And they did not have cyber insurance, so not only did they sustain that full cost of that loss, but they also had to pay to get everything mitigated and remediated, and that was a very big ticket. I mean, those are never less than $100,000-$200,000, and they can go north to any size number depending on what your enterprise does and who, how liable you would be for allowing your data to be taken and exfiltrated. So, again, if you look at the results of that poll are, it's 60-40 people that are working on it and have it. That's 60%, and 40% don't have it at all. And at some point you're going to have to, because the risk is going to be too high. Now, you may have a company or an enterprise that has minimal risk as far as people getting in your network and disrupting it or pretending to be you doesn't really offer that much risk to your organizations. And every enterprise is going to have to evaluate what that risk means to them, right? So so what kind of risks are there to an enterprise? Like I said, this is a logistics company, it was $10 million right out of their pocket. They could have had a much more robust security strategy prior to that attack and have recovered in a day instead of weeks. Right. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, they would have had enough money to pay for their cybersecurity forever. Way more than they needed to pay for their cybersecurity forever if they'd had that in place prior to that one single outage. So, but there are other, what's some of the other risks to an enterprise are, I mean, right now what we see, and you guys I'll ask you to chime in on this, but what we're seeing now is they're getting into the supply chain and they're working their way into vendors that supply us things like hardware and, services, software, that sort of thing. We've had a couple incidents over the last couple of years where supply chain attacks have gotten vulnerabilities into a product that was not made by the people that produce the product, right? So these multi-tier supply chain attacks are becoming way more prevalent as well. So, talk a little bit about that. Tracy, you've heard what was it, NVIDIA that had who was it? You were talking, one of us was talking about that 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So.
Just recently, due to or because of the cyber attack activity and bad actors. And one caveat to this is the reason that this is such a big thing right now in short form is that we're not just talking about individual nation states performing cyber activity. What we're really talking about is kind of an upswell of these mafioso style hacker gangs like Conte, for example, and then picking sides in this, regardless of whatever that may be. And then you also have, like Bob was indicating, these closet hacker activists that go on the dark web and download a tool from Conti for 25 bucks and then just kind of, throw it out in the wild. So what that's done, the downside is that there's no pointed attack. There's no snipers in this for the most part. They're just sticking these vulnerabilities out into the wild, at least pointing them in the general direction of something. And, just much like Stuxnet, that happened in Iran some years ago, these things don't stop at the back door. They continue to go to the neighbor next door and the neighbor next door. They get in the power lines, they get in the water lines figuratively, and they spread everywhere. So in the case of NVIDIA, what had been now they know to be a chip vulnerability, going back as far at this point, as much as they'll divulge, for almost 10 years, what has happened is this gumbo of a web attack, white noise, it's hitting the internet from every angle, activated and found some vulnerabilities in the chipset. The same thing happened with Toyota. So NVIDIA, I'd like to add is that I would bet that if you have a computer, I'd bet you a shiny dime that NVIDIA is probably embedded in your desktop or laptop as a resource, a hardware resource. So that's just your local machine. The other thing was Toyota, Japan was taken completely offline. They couldn't manufacture cars at all. All plants, all facilities closed down for 4 days. So there's manufacturing. Then you had industries, and you had an indication just yesterday of Google, Amazon, and AWS, or Azure and AWS, all experiencing what is still not advertised, or at least openly advertised yet, some form of widespread internet disruption from May East to May West and across the Atlantic. So these things are out there, and there's no running from it. And you really, I mean, kind of the direction I've tried to take GDS in this is we've taken the assumption of assumed breach for this organization. So we build our rules, our techniques, and our tactics around MITRE. And rather than just looking for just the newest and latest, greatest, CVE or hash, we're looking at machine behaviors and human behaviors, processes that should not happen when they happen at a certain time of day or night. And what this security maturity level will get you at the end of the day, as you mature up, you'll be able to be more and more and more prepared, not just for day-to-day activity, not just for targeted attacks against your company, but what everybody can probably agree is a geopolitical landscape that is not settling down anytime soon. And we are right now historically in what we would call the first cyber war. So you have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the why you need it kind of statement as it relates to this. I mean, it's just the landscape that we're in. Everyone's going to be having to bear up under this risk. If you haven't gotten a security strategy developed, you're going to have to do it. It doesn't matter, I mean, like we said, this particular webinar is not about who you do it with. You just need to do it. You need to be having these conversations with security professionals. It doesn't matter who they are, and you don't have a lot of time to spend not doing it. I mean, you really don't. It's just there's too much risk and too much risk that has to be mitigated. So how do you achieve it? That's like the next part of what it is that the webinar is all about, is how do you actually achieve, a security maturity level. So Robert, you want to take a run again at, kind of, outline a bunch of the elements that are part of a security maturity level?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bob. So a couple of things on there, just building point with you and Tracy had mentioned earlier. The software development for hackers, it's an industry out there, right? They even have SLAs, just like service level agreements. If I subscribe to your software plan and I'm using it for my hacking, there's a way that security manufacturers develop a way to mitigate it. I, as a software developer, would change it for my subscribers to be able to circumvent those attacks. Right, so you can see that whole ecosystem, is operating against the enterprise, right? Your enterprise has to be right 100% of the time, and we also know that that's not achievable. So we're going to take a look at a few different ways of, analyzing the telemetry that's coming in. Bob, you mentioned it earlier. It's, the indicators, right? Indicators of compromise. So what's going on in the environment? What is changed in the environment? Have we seen an increase in a particular type of traffic? We might also just look for things that are very low prevalence, right? If I'm looking at across the entire organization, 5,000 endpoints, they should all generally have about the same software on it. If I have 2 or 3 that have a software package on it that's really doesn't belong there, it's kind of hard to find that needle in a haystack from a human perspective. But through automation and tools, we can detect even those low prevalence, because generally those are the outliers. Those are generally the malwares that have been put into the environment and just waiting to be launched. So it doesn't have to be a very noisy environment. Sometimes we're looking for things that are quiet and hidden in the corner. So we want to make sure that inventory we discussed earlier covers that hardware piece. To Tracy's point earlier, tell us what is in that hardware. What are the firmware versions? What are the hardware versions? So we can compare it against known vulnerability databases. And we also want to take a look at the software that's installed on those as well too, so we can understand the risk that is there. And again, it's not a static environment. You could have vulnerabilities in that software that go back, 2 or 3 years. But when it becomes published and known, then at that point it tends to get more exploitable. So even if you got a vulnerability scan and you got all green checks, today, 6 months from now, even with the same software, you might have a few red X's in there because the vulnerability that existed even then is now known. So you can see this whole awareness thing is not just a one-time shot. It's something that's going to have to occur continuously. And then going back to your organizations, you have different attack vectors for different types of organizations. Is it through email? Do you have an IoT presence? Do you have an extremely mobile workforce? So you have to look at how are you utilizing the network and all the different ways that you're exchanging data, so you can understand where your attack vectors are, so you can start taking a look at how do you look at the telemetry in those areas to see if there's an indication of compromise.
Yeah, I was going to say that, there are ways to improve your security maturity level and you not spend a dime on a product. I'll give you an example. Just having that device inventory, that's important. Having a software inventory, that's important. Having network topology maps, that's important. Having your network segmented correctly, that's important. Policies and procedures about IT use, how your employees can use the network and in what ways. That's something that could be addressed in just a policy form that allows you to have that sort of control. You can also, change management process, because believe it or not, once you know what devices are on your network and how they're hooked together through a topology, when you make changes to it, if you don't do that in a controlled way through a change management process, then it won't be any time at all, and your inventory won't be current, and your topology maps won't be accurate. And all of those things are the basis on which you start building up on top of, so that they're the foundation that you start building all of these other elements of a security maturity level. And that simple things like backups, if you store your backups on your network and they're visible on your network, that's a problem. Even if they're encrypted, that's a problem, because they can still encrypt an encrypted file. It still works that way. So you may not know that, but that's exactly what can happen. So having your backup encrypted, first of all, is important. Having it geodiverse, in other words, not local to the network that it was taken from, is another thing that you can do to protect yourself from them being able to encrypt your backup volumes so that you can't restore and try to get back into operation. So, and those things are you're already doing backups. You just need to, in this case, you just need to store them somewhere else, right? That may be the way you go about it. You haven't spent a dime on extra software or anybody to come in and configure, but this is just what you can do. And your user accounts, that vector is a very strong vector for people getting into your network. And a simple question is this: are all the people that are in your Active Directory or your access control list, are they all still employed with the company? When's the last time somebody went through there and did an inventory of people and made sure that the accounts were current in your current access control list, and that the roles and responsibilities were well defined, and those roles and responsibilities only allowed those people to get to devices that they should be getting to as a part of their role and responsibility in the company. If you haven't done that, you could do that tomorrow. You could go through your access control directories tomorrow and start looking for cutting those people out of the system, right? Now, to multi-factor authentication, you're going to pay something for that, right? But I'll tell you this: if you were going to take like the top 3 things or 4 things that you really needed to concentrate on, if you had no strategy whatsoever, you need to be doing some sort of staff training for activities that are coming through cyber or electronic means, right? There are lots of ways to do that. There are lots of companies that allow you to do this, but it's training, that they go in and take training so they know what kind of links to click on and what kind of links to not click on. You should be doing that tomorrow. That's actually a very low cost thing that you can do to improve your overall risk mitigation plan, right? The other thing is that access control, like I was talking about, that is a critical aspect of what you need to do, because that is where everybody compromises the network, right? So multi-factor authentication can be a part of that, so that you're not just using, single sign-on. Something simple as your password rules. Are you going to allow them to be? They have to be complex passwords, but also they expire on a timely manner, right? Those are little things that, again, help you from an organizational standpoint mitigate your risk. And then 2-factor authentication, or in a bigger picture, zero trust sort of models as they relate to access control. Those are all aspects that you can put into place, which will make it more difficult. It won't make it impossible, but it'll make it more difficult for people to be able to get into your network and move laterally through your network, right? And those are your certificates. We already talked about that. Just understanding those digital certificates and how to maintain control of those. again, these are small. These are really just the beginning aspects of what makes up a security strategy, right? Log retention. You need to be keeping the logs on your network devices so that if you have to go unwind and figure out how somebody got in and what they were doing, just maintaining your logs of all of your routers, switches, firewalls, all those things matter. You know what I mean? So, Tracy, why don't you take a couple yourself? You got some favorites in the framework that you like to talk about. We're just getting to the point now where we're covering the bases so that we could get to the proactive security services. Why don't you talk about that? Talk about the proactive, how that takes these fundamentals and then levels them up yet again.
Yeah, for sure. The one thing I did want to add to, Robert brought up in the beginning of his discussion recently, talking about how these ransomware gangs are much like a company. If you want to spend some time laughing, recently, well, I think a couple of days ago, the Conti ransomware gang was hacked. Another hacker group hacked them, and they they dumped all their internal quote unquote company message traffic onto the internet. And it's legitimately a company. There is an HR, there's salaries, there is a customer facing media representative.
Right.
There's arguments, the help desk didn't this and the engineer won't talk to me. It's a snapshot of your own enterprise and organization. So it'd be funny to go look at that. It's funny and it's scary at the same time. But when Bob starts talking about some of the more proactive things, listen, you can have everything. You can have every point of sale product on the market sold to you from a security standpoint. One of the big things right now is that we all need to achieve zero trust. Well, it's important for everybody to understand that zero trust is the same thing as the security maturity leveling. It's a goal to work towards and achieve. There is not a zero trust single product, right? It's an ecosystem of a methodology, a philosophy that you work towards in terms of zero trust. The other thing that I would like to evangelize is that, in terms of how you deal with all of this data and the analytics that are happening, on your endpoints and from your network scanning and your policies and procedures and your access control and your endpoints and your servers and your firewalls and your routers and your switches, it can be all consuming and almost impossible to manage unless you have deployed a SOC in your environment to some degree, right? If you can get those logs tuned from all those various angles, from your edge network, your internal network to see lateral movement, if you can apply your risk-based principles, MITRE and NIST, in your SOC environment, what you can begin to do is identify, based on these best practices, what you should consider to be most important for you and your company to defend against. And without that, it's really hard to get a good understanding of your battle space. Even if you do all these things really well, right? You have to consider the fact that without understanding what's happening to these devices and what's happening to your endpoints and what's happening to your mobile devices and on your Wi-Fi networks, you're really in the dark. You can't judge what your real risk even is, even after you've done many of these things for your security maturity leveling. So, you need to move towards some form of a SOC. You need to utilize that and grow it to a point where, once you can get it to a certain point, it'll even help you automate some of the return processes back out to your firewalls and your switches and to your endpoints so that human beings don't have to put hands on keyboards. The SOC and the services provided through that are proactive all the way out to your firewall, and you can automate many of these processes, feeling more secure, cutting, labor down, all the things that we're trying to do, make yourself more mature, more secure. That's why I've always said since day one that cybersecurity and risk management should be said in the same sentence as your revenue bottom line when you're talking about it as an executive, because they are tied at the hip, and going forward, they will never not be tied at the hip again.
Yeah, well, you know, when Tracy talks about a SOC, I mean, we talk about it because we had to build one as a managed service provider, but there are a lot of elements to a SOC, right? I mean, that ecosystem, just for running our SOC, we have a thing called a SIM, you know, which aggregates all of those logs and collates them, and does some preliminary analysis on them. And then we have a SOAR, which is an orchestration piece of software that takes that and applies business rules to it. Between the two of them, they do different levels of inspection of all of those logs and try to draw conclusions based on, you know, the data that's flowing through those. So, I mean, that's a big lift if you're not, you know, I mean, if you don't have the technical capability inside of your enterprise, that can be a big lift. There are a lot of good service providers out there. I mean, you've got, you know, when you make this decision, you're gonna need to talk to people to try to really understand what's involved in it, and you need to really talk to somebody who'll give it to you straight. There is no Walmart for security. It doesn't work that way. You can't pay Walmart prices and expect it to really ever do anything more than, from a marketing standpoint, check a box. But it's functionally, it's a much more complex thing that you have to manage. So, you know, if you're not able to do it yourself, then you need to go find someone who can really advise you how to work, you know, through that process. And as kind of a final example of this, Robert, why don't you talk about the danger of buying multiple point products and not looking at it from a
Yeah,
integrated standpoint?
absolutely. So, you know, we're talking about earlier the attack vectors, right? So, imagine this scenario. Okay, we have a day one attack. It kind of made it through. It made it through the email system, right? So it was nothing that was known before. They called these day zero attacks. So it made it into the system. So now it's behind the firewall. Okay, so let's say within 6 to 12 hours, we now have known that there's a vulnerability. Well, what can we do with that now? So it's already past our firewall. It's already past our email server. It's into our environment. But if you have a combination of products that speak well to each other, then you can take the information that that email server says, hey, the thing I let through turns out it's a bad thing. I can now inform my endpoint protection software, hey, you know that thing I let in? It's sitting on these 3 laptops. Go ahead and quarantine and remediate it. Oh, and by the way, as an email server, I'm not going to let it come in anymore. Oh, and by the way, I'll also tell the firewall, if you see this, do not let it get in. So you can see as that exchange of data between these complementary systems, they're sharing that data. So even though they're protecting different elements of the network, they can take what they've learned and turn around and leverage it to all the other, areas of the network, to prevent further infection. And of course, it can also help with the remediation. Now that we know that it's in there, and maybe we know it's on, 3 or 4 laptops or servers, or whatever the case may be, we can take action on those servers to quarantine and remediate those before they spread any further. So it's really important for all of those products to work well together. And to your point, Bob, those are all sources of data that goes into the SIM, right? So I'll get telemetry logs from my firewall, from my servers, from my email, from my endpoints, from all of these things, and it brings it up into a SIM and it looks at them all together and looks for some commonalities. Okay, I see all these activities. This turned out to be a true attack, and then our SOAR would take a look at how do we automate the remediation of that, and then put our playbook into play there. So that's why it's important for don't look at things in individual silos. It's important to take a look at how they all behave very well together.
Yeah, and I think we didn't really talk about endpoint, malware protection, but I mean that's an obvious. We almost leave that as a default. Everybody's going to have antivirus and malware protection. Right? And really, you need DNS protection too, right? Your domain name server, you need that kind of protection too, because that's another way to help filter and mitigate things. So
prevents it before it happens. Think about it. If the viruses are in there, you're spending a lot of horsepower to compute and figure out, is there something there? If you're looking at it from a reputation perspective, it's almost like avoiding the coal versus recovering from the coal. I'm going to try to go to a website that is known to have a bad reputation. I'm going to stop my users from actually even getting there in the first place, avoiding the infection in the first place, which kind of brings me up to something else. You mentioned earlier about the staff security. Kind of think about it as employee security, all your users out there. Because we've been talking about a lot of technical stuff here. So there's a technical side of our audience would really understand those pieces, but the vast majority of the end users would not understand some of the things we've discussed. But if you bring in a security training for the end user so they can understand behavior, what to do, what not to do, like, hey, if somebody just hands you a USB drive, do not hook that up to your system. You have no idea where it was, right? Some things along those lines. When you get that email in and it looks a little weird, because there's a pattern of behavior that's changed. My CFO wants me to send a check to who? No, that's not right. So there's an awareness training from a user perspective that transcends a lot of this stuff. So that whole training piece, I'm going to put that one way up there in the top, 3 or 4 things that an organization can do, and actually kind of do it in parallel. You're securing the network, but let's train our users as well too. Identify behavior and bring in a culture of security into the organization. A lot of people will train on safety, right? Office ergonomics and some things along those lines. But are we taking the same steps when we're approaching security and when we're training our individuals? And look, that goes a long way with the cyber insurance organization as well too. How are you protecting your systems, but also how are you educating your people?
Well, I'm going to tell you that the reason it carries such a weight with your underwriters is because 80% of all attacks come through phishing attacks, which come through email. So I mean, there's a reason why they asked that question early on. It's one of the most economical investments you can make to have the biggest impact on your network hardening, bar none. So I think we're at the point now where we're ready to start taking some questions. And the other thing is, network vulnerability assessments, big part of the security maturity level, having those vulnerability assessments done. So it is important that you get them done. So we've got a poll going. Sure, we'd like to know where you guys are in you're in the process of having your network. And when we say vulnerability assessment, we're talking about a piece of software that's loaded up inside of your network that goes and looks at servers and network devices and infrastructure and evaluates them from operating system level, patch level, application level, configuration level. That's what we're talking about when we talk about that. So I think now we're going to open it up for questions. Oh, you guys can see the poll. I think you can see the poll, right? So, in reality, what's going to happen over time is you're going to wind up having to get those a lot more frequently, because even if you don't have some of these other parts of the security maturity level in place so that you can show some continuity of observation and reaction over time, it's going to be just part of the normal part of doing business is getting these vulnerability scans, both internal and external.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that, as we've discussed many times, if it's not going to be directly impactful from your insurer, it's going to probably affect you through a federal or state channel. There's just no working around it anymore, and I don't believe that anybody's trying to. I think that everybody has genuine, tries to have good stewardship over their organization and their company and their people, right? But we're at a point now where things like this, the vulnerability assessments, they're just really going to have to become a part of what you consider your business continuity plan. In the same way, us in Louisiana, once a year, we break out our hurricane, our bad weather, or company continuity guideline, and dust it off and make sure we have all the things and all the stuff and assign new people roles. And that's the same thing that you have to do. You're going to end up having to do with your cybersecurity, because it's just as, if not more so, impactful than a natural disaster. I mean, you can assume the same amount of debt and loss through a major ransomware attack as you could through a hurricane, and that's just factually easy to find out anywhere you want to go Google.
We got a question.
I was going to say we have a few questions there. So I think someone might look for some definitions. So one of the first ones up there was the zero trust model that you were discussing, Tracy. So kind of look at it this way, people will take a device today, just put it up on the network. You don't have to authenticate. They don't really posture a profile. They're not looking for risk and stuff like that. And we need to get away from that. That's a very trusting model, right? We need to get to a zero trust model. So that way, as an asset or a person is joining the network, they're queried, right? They take a look at, are you who you say you are? Are you at the right patch levels? Are you going to introduce any risk? So when we take a look at that zero trust, essentially is, hey, guys, we don't want to trust anybody who's coming to the network. We need them to prove who they are and that they actually belong there. So in a general sense, that's kind of the
their
trust.
hardware, right? So their hardware address is nailed up so that we know that when you drop that hardware device on the network, it's only going to be allowed to see the things that it can see, which is kind of the way we do it. There's this question about.
I'm sorry.
It's in our. One of the other questions was, since we're an MSP, he's asking a question of him. Are you encountering increased vulnerabilities and targeted attacks at our operational technology, and what about manufacturing sectors if they are, if they're using things like SCADA and PLCs,
I can take that one, Bob.
Yeah,
I can take that one. Yeah, so this one kind of goes into that segmentation we've discussed a little bit earlier today. So when we work with, we'll call them plants, right? They have an IT network and they have an operational technology network. And oftentimes those two networks are physically separated. So there's generally a segmentation there. And even the ones that are joined at some point, they're generally firewalled from each other. So, if you kind of progress from the internet down into it, it's, the internet, there's a firewall, there's IT network with general users and so forth. Then there's another firewall, and then there's the operational, plant technology and stuff out there. So they're kind of hidden way back in the back of multiple layers of firewall. So oftentimes they get into a little bit of a false sense of security. It's still extremely important to scan those networks for devices to see, is there anything there that doesn't belong there, but also what is the state of those devices? What are the firmwares? Let's compare it against a current vulnerability database as well too. So segmentation is the key point there. And then of course, after that is, inventory and constant analysis.
Yeah, the last question, we got time for this last question. The question is cyber insurance reliable for small businesses in general? And do they usually provide security assessments? Cyber insurance is, again, it's just like any other. Let me say this: cyber insurance will sell insurance to any size company. In fact, that they are going to evaluate your risk, right? What your risk profile is, and in our case, when we applied for our cyber insurance, we had to actually have multiple interviews with our subject matter experts, with their security experts, so that they could derive a level of risk about what risk profile we had, right? And so once they did that, then they really wanted us to give them some artifacts about how we were actually functioning and operating the business. And so that's what it required for us. But again, we're an MSP with lots of companies that are at a nexus point, and kind of the segue into, have we experienced more attacks as an MSP, or are we encountered a lot more increased vulnerabilities? The vulnerabilities we see are the ones everybody sees, because every ecosystem that we manage is basically, the same sorts of Windows servers, Linux servers, switches, firewalls. So we don't see an increase in vulnerabilities. We don't, up to this point, we haven't seen an increase in overt attacks, but we're really paranoid, and we run exercises all the time anyway. We pretend that we're getting attacked all the time so that we can run through our processes. So I would say that no, we don't necessarily see that we're getting attacked more than anybody else at this point from an MSP standpoint. And yes, cyber insurance can be used by any small business. Again, they're going to evaluate what you have in place and then what the risk profile is for you. And then, do they provide those security assessments? No, but there are lots of people who do security assessments, and they would recommend, that's probably what you're going to have to do for the price of entry to really kind of even get going. Is the better thing to do is to go ahead and have your security assessments done by someone and have a plan about how you're going to work through them, and then talk to your cyber insurance underwriter, because you're going to show that you are much more proactive and ahead of the problem, to be able to show that you're working on your risk profile, and that's going to give you a lot higher probability. So I think that takes us right to the time.
I believe it does.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And I would like to take this time to thank you, Tracy, Bob, and Robert, for your time today and your knowledge on the subject matter, and for answering our questions for our attendees. At this time, I would like to tell everyone that we will be sending you a recording of this webinar. And if you have any further questions, you will be receiving an email where you can share those questions with us after this webinar. So this time I'd like to conclude. Thank you for attending, and we hope you have learned and enjoyed this presentation. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.